Thank you so much for Dr. Kapil for joining me today. We're going to be talking about ethnic conflict, ethnic violence, and what we can learn from history. So thank you so much for joining us. As an introduction, I will speak a little bit about Dr. Mukesh Kapila. Dr. Mukesh Kapila is a medical professional and a professor of global health and humanitarian affairs at the University of Manchester. He is a specialist in crisis and conflict management, humanitarian efforts, post-conflict development, and HIV and AIDS. Kapila is also a special representative for the Aegis Trust for prevention of crimes against humanity. He has authored two books, Against the Tide of Evil and A Stranger to Kindness, and you can look at those on his website. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here, and I'm at your disposal.
Yes. So to start off with, can we just talk a little bit about what ethnic conflict is and what ethnic violence is?
Well, firstly, ethnicity is something that we as human beings have constructed. I mean, of course, people are different, and it's true that people who come from different parts of the world, they have slight differences. For example, in their blood groups, for example, in their hair or the color of their skin. And we know, for example, that certain diseases are more common in certain communities. So it's not to say that there are no human differences in the huge diversity of humanity that is out there in all corners of the world. But by and large, the differences between groups of people, what we might call ethnic groups, are much less than the differences that are there normally between people. So, in other words, while there are differences because our genetics are different, we are all descended from the same roots, if you like. And in the end, there are no ethnic groups as such, except those that we have constructed in our own mind and in our own social structures. And the reason we humans have, over history, learned to subdivide ourselves into categories is, I think, partly evolutionary. This was a reaction in ancient times to groups of people who were living together and in a hostile world against both nature, animals, and other communities. They kind of herded together and they had to construct a narrative, a kind of rationale for survival. So, if I live in my village and across the mountain is you and your people, and I don't know who you are, but I'm afraid that you might come and get me. So, in order to protect myself and my community, we start constructing images, specialisms that set us apart from you and your people. And this is how, in evolutionary survival terms, perhaps the idea of ethnicity arose. And but ultimately, the bottom line is that ethnicity is all in the mind. There is no hardwired biological reason for it. It's more a sociological reason for creating these ethnic divides. And in fact, a lot of studies have been done that show that most of it are all mixed up people. If you were to study your genes, you will find traces of genetic material from all corners of the world. If you like, we are all and mixed up, if I can put it that way. But because we are a little bit hardwired for ethnic difference, then inevitably to protect those differences, people have conjured up this notion of ethnic rivalry or ethnic conflict. And actually, it's not done by people, it's done by leaders. By and large, and if you look at ethnic conflicts around the world, we can come back to that. It's what happens is that people of different groupings, or different towns, or neighborhoods, or villages, or countries, they may happily coexist. But then along comes someone who is wishing to manipulate that difference. And I'm afraid human beings being manipulable, gullible all over the world, then it doesn't take long for some self-serving political leader to create artificial differences and then to exploit those differences and set one group of people against another group of people. And that generates a conflict. Having said that, not all conflicts need to be violent conflicts. I mean, after all, conflict is also part of life. And conflict is not necessarily always bad, because very often, if you look around yourself, look around the world and history of the world, it is only through a degree of conflict that all the human rights that we take for granted today have been born. So, in the old days, for example, women were not allowed to vote in most countries. Then women had to fight for the vote. And then in many cultures, for example, women were not allowed to go to school. They had to fight for it. Or we had slavery, and then the slaves and those who opposed slavery had to fight against human slavery. And the same applies to everything else: the right to health, the right to food, the right to be able to speak your mind, the right of free association, the right of public speech, the right to practice your own religion. These are all kind of rights that, I'm sorry to say that historically, people have had to fight over, either in one community or another community. And sooner or later, these rights, which have been won through conflict in one community or one neighborhood or one country, are kind of gradually extended to become what we now call human rights that we granted. And sometimes when bad people come along and bad influences come along, people have to stand up for themselves and fight against those injustices. So, I mean, I'm already talking loosely here, but this is where conflict comes in, But I think the extent to which conflicts turn into violent conflicts is where I think there is a space for plenty of debate, dialogue, argument, as well as kind of contentious views. I mean, the differences between people can be reflected in conflict, but conflicts don't necessarily have to be mediated through violence. And, it may or may not sound real to people as you observe the world and look what's happening around the world. But actually, if you look at the world through the long lens of history, by and large, the world has become more peaceful over time. Whereas in the old days, we would have fought over every single scrap of food or water or shelter or for every single item. Today, we're still fighting over water in some places. Look at around, we're still debating the issue of water rights in Ethiopia's dam with Sudan and Egypt, for example. But these kind of disputes or differences should not necessarily result in violence. And that's at the heart of actually the modern debate, whether or not we have become civilized enough as humanity to be able to mediate our difference, including ethnic differentiations, through peaceful means, or do we need to have violent means of settling our differences?
Yeah, I think that was a very good explanation of those, because I think a lot of times those two words are used interchangeably, and it's very important to to classify them differently and to be able to understand and analyze them as such. And I think we'll come back to how ethnic violences erupt and what we could do about it. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about your experience in Sudan and Rwanda and how it has shaped your view on such matters.
Well, my life has been an accident of history in a way, in the sense that through the various careers I have followed, I've ended up in places where I have unfortunately witnessed man's worst inhumanity to other human beings. I mean, in Rwanda, for example, I was there in 1994, at that time representing the British government, and it was, I had a grandstand view during the 100 days of killings in 94 on what one group, the Hutus, did to another group, the Tutsis. And this was the last genocide of the 20th century. And basically, the background to that was many, many decades of contrived differences between the two communities. They had lived together for several hundred years, as far as one can tell. But different rulers, including colonial rulers, had, in their attempt to manage the territory, created artificial differences and played upon the rivalries, the natural rivalries that exist between different groups. And by deliberately creating injustices and differentiations between groups, setting up one group as more superior to another group for the purposes of colonialism, for example, for the purposes of dividing and rule. The situation was ripe for the big genocide to take place in 94. By the way, I think all these genocides have got a precursor to them. I mean, if you look, for example, at the mega one of the Holocaust in Europe against the Jews in Nazi Germany, well, actually, programs against the Jews have been going on for several hundred years. I mean, at least for the last 200 years, periodically there were paroxysms of violence against the Jews, in Germany, in France, and elsewhere in Russia. And this was basically the Jews were identified, to have certain characteristics. And often when things are going wrong in society, economically or socially, the scapegoat were the Jews. So in a way, many genocides were practiced over centuries until Hitler came along, and he turned the whole thing into a nasty, very organized ideology. And exactly the same thing happened in Rwanda. So the Hutu leaders of the time in 1994, what they did was they studied the previous genocides. After all, some of them were actually studied in Europe, and they studied the Nazi Holocaust genocide. And they, using modern techniques of organization in a way, but very old-fashioned weapons. In this, I mean, the Germans used the gas chambers, which was a high tech of the 1940s. In the case of the Hutu-Tutsi divide and the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in '94, they were using the traditional, agricultural weapons and so on against that. Now, but the ideology that a bunch of people turning against other bunch of people was heavily orchestrated. So this is one of the characteristics that I learned from my first experience, and that is that genocide is not random acts of violence committed by one group of people against another group of people, because quite honestly, people are insufficiently organized to do that. It requires a state or a state authority to commit genocide, a state or quasi-state authority. By and large, if you go through history, it is states that commit genocide, not ordinary communities that do that. Of course, they can't do it on their own, and they mobilize a community to do the dirty job. In the case of Rwanda, killing, literally somewhere in the region of nearly 1 million people within 100 days, which must be some kind of mass record in terms of mass slaughter. In fact, it was a mass record. So my point is that what the Rwanda experience to me illustrated was that it wasn't the ethnic differences which were there before, but the fact that you can manipulate those differences, turn those into an organized program by state power and state authority. It happened. And I saw it again 10 years later when I found myself in Sudan as the UN coordinator, and Darfur emerged. Darfur emerged in the sense of in this remote state in Western Sudan, and the government in Khartoum, which is led by at that time by an Islamic fundamentalist group, turned against the people of Darfur, most of whom were Black African ethnic groups. So it became, it wasn't a religious conflict, both sides were Muslim, but it was very definitely a racist conflict in the sense the perpetrators, the regime in Khartoum, was an Arab supremacist, just like the Nazis believed in Aryan supremacy in Nazi Germany, or the Hutus believed in the supremacy of the Hutus against the Tutsis in Rwanda. And then again, it is the state of Sudan at that time, led by the president at that time, Omar al-Bashir, who then organized the full panoply of state power upon the Black African citizens of the Darfur region, and that led to maybe at least at least 500,000 deaths, if not more, and 4 or 5 million people displaced or refugees in the months to follow. So what I saw for myself was a common pattern emerging in all of this. And in the course of this, you have certain stages. So, for example, what I witnessed in the case of Sudan was the orchestration of hate speech. So, to mobilize the community, you turn to the easiest way possible. And nowadays, it's the mass media. So there were calls out for crushing the cockroaches in Darfur or in Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile, the other ethnic the minority African communities in Sudan at the time, and we have the same thing in the case of Rwanda. So by mobilizing hatred using modern communication techniques, the modern genocides were in some senses even more efficient than the older ones. And I saw elements of this also, not just in these places, but when I went to Srebrenica during the Bosnian War, saw the after effects of the genocide in Srebrenica. And I also went to Cambodia when I was working in the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights' his office in Geneva, and could see for myself what happened when the Cambodian people turned on each other, aided and abetted from outsiders perhaps. And we had a massive genocide in Cambodia, the Pol Pot.
Yeah, it's and I mean, we're talking about this in the backdrop of the ethnic violence that we've seen and witnessed in Ethiopia. And I think like one of the things that you said that stood out to me is just that hate speech. I think what we are seeing in the case of Ethiopia is just, we've seen a lot of like social media accounts just giving out this like a revised history and blaming people, and like at some point it kind of feels like those people are trying to make others not view those people from those ethnic groups not as humans but as this perpetrators, and like so there's that dehumanizing factor, and we definitely see it on social media, and especially when it comes to a country like Ethiopia with long history and long histories of abuses against many different ethnic groups. It's very easy to use that to manipulate the I guess the communities into violence. And I think one thing that stands out for me, and I think it stands out for other people too, is the fact that like these atrocities are being committed by people who are your neighbors, who are people, everyday people. It's not the military coming in, and in some cases maybe, but what's very disheartening and alarming is when this happens by people you consider to be your friends, your family, and all of that, and they turn around. So I think that's one of the things I struggle with, and maybe you can put some insight into that. Is just that tendency of people that you trust and you believe that you thought were part of your community one day coming and slaughtering you.
Yeah. Well, yes, you're absolutely right. And it reminds me of going to a certain location in Rwanda, which is now, by the way, a museum, and you can go there and you can see something like 5,000 skeletons in this building or museum. And the history of that place is that all those 5,000 people were killed in the hours of darkness one night. Now, even an army would have some difficulty in killing 5,000 people that quickly, in a way. And so this was done by people turning on each other, like on a mass scale. And why does that happen is your question, and how does it happen? Well, why it happens is, I think, going back to our beginning, evolutionary biologists and scientists tell us it's to do with people's innate survival instinct. It's a somewhat negative evolutionary instinct, but basically it runs like, if I'm afraid of myself and my loved ones around me, then the instinct kicks in to do everything to safeguard myself and my own. And that may mean turning every single norm I know and destroying everyone who may be a threat to me and mine. And this, we're here talking about instinct. We're not talking about rationality. Moments of rationality and modicum of education will realize that clearly this is absurd. But when your blood is up like that, and when you fear so much, then you will do anything. And that capability to commit the most horrendous acts on someone else for your own self-preservation is something that is present in all of us. Should also make us quite humble, because the seeds of evil are deeply embedded in each of us at the same time as the capacity to do good. That's why in these historic experiences that we're talking about, neighbors can turn on neighbors. In fact, when neighbors turn on neighbors, they are far more vicious than strangers coming to murder you, because at least strangers have the advantage of not knowing you. So there is a slightly less emotional aspect. But when neighbors turn on neighbors, there's a whole deep emotionality that is uncorked. The dark side of that emotionality.
Yeah.
So I suppose the conclusion from that is that within human nature, there are many good sides in us, and I talk about that in my book, No Stranger to Kindness. But at the same time, there lurks this dark evil in all of us. But
Mm-hmm.
just because it's in there doesn't mean to say it has to be activated. Therefore, it still needs an external agent, to an
Mm-hmm.
external threat, to activate that demon that is lurking in all of us. And that's what we were saying earlier on. It's, people don't just suddenly get up and say, right, I'm going to go and murder everyone in the neighborhood because I don't like the look of them or something. Someone
Mm-hmm.
manipulates them. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and preys on their sense of insecurity or their sense of terror or fear, and
Mm-hmm.
then moves them. That's why I think when we come to accountability, it's very, very important to get to the bottom of how things happen and to hold responsible or accountable those who triggered the whole thing, uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
uh, who made it possible, the leaders, the malevolent leaders who are
Mm.
ultimately responsible for unleashing mass murders like this.
Yeah. And I guess another question I have related to that is how does one go past it? Because, like I said, it's and like you mentioned, it's the neighbors that turned on their neighbors, and so how because one thing that scares me, and I think that should scare every Ethiopian and every human, in all honesty, is whenever there's an act of violence, how do you stop the cycle? Because then you start seeing the perpetrators of that violence, and then in that direction, that ethnic group being the bad one. So now, like, a big group will be dehumanized again, and then the cycle continues. So like a few years down the line, there will be another group that will be targeted. So how do we break this violence, and how do we heal a nation?
Well, I've got to unpack this complex issue. Firstly, there's violence everywhere in the world, to some extent, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's conflict everywhere in the world, but then on top of that, there is violence everywhere in the world. Uh, but all violence don't turn into mass atrocities, right?
Mm-hmm.
If
Yes.
if that was the case, then my God, I don't know, either no one would be surviving, or I don't know where we would be as a planet, as peoples. So it's very important not to conflate violence,
Mm-hmm.
mass atrocities, or genocide, or crimes against humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And genocide or crimes against humanity or mass atrocities, depending on what label you want to put on particular situations, they are not just the the gradual, progressive end of a cycle of violence. I mean, uh, because if that was the case, then all violence, if left, would end in genocide. It doesn't, thank God.
Yeah.
And we also know from historical experience that violence mitigation
Mm-hmm.
and prevention doesn't necessarily stop mass atrocities and genocide. If you look at historic episodes of mass atrocities, they have taken place, many have taken place during situations of violence, but many more have taken place in situations allegedly peaceful. Even the Nazi rise of the Nazis took place in a peaceful, democratic Germany. Uh, Same in other places. Important to make that distinction. But if a cycle of violence is heading in the direction towards being transformed into something which is uniquely and quite separate, turning into atrocities, mass atrocities, crimes against humanity, amounting to or moving towards genocide or becoming genocide, then that happens again by deliberate act. I mean, many bad leaders will encourage violence, especially if it suits them politically or to maintain their own hegemonic power, but they will stop short of encouraging atrocities or genocides, if,
Mm-hmm.
if you like to see. But there are some, and we've seen this, for example, we've seen this in the last few years, and now in the case of the Uyghurs and the Chinese government and Uyghurs, or in the case of the Myanmar authorities and the Rohingya. And those two situations, for example, justify the use of the word genocide or crimes against humanity. And the difference is the intention. When the intention of the leaders of a particular troubled area is to destroy a group on account of their identity, and by destroying, we don't mean necessarily kill everyone, because it's very difficult to eliminate every single person, though some regimes have tried that. That's what the Hutus tried in Rwanda, in the Tutsis, and definitely Hitler tried that in the case of the Jews. Um, um, but to destroy another group means getting rid of them physically, but equally getting rid of them. But if you can't do that, getting rid of those people's sense of identity, their culture, their way of life, their sense of self. And they can do that through a range of measures. They can, for example, as happened in the case of Darfuris, a systematic program of rape, where the Arabs military, led by the regime in Khartoum, went on a systematic policy of raping black women in Darfur on the grounds so as to, as they said, it give them Arab babies, and that way changing the composition of the population. We have the same thing in Rwanda. Maybe half the women in Rwanda were raped in that particular time. I mean, it boggles the mind when you start thinking like that half a nation's women might have been raped. Not might have been raped, they probably were raped. I mean, we know that tens of thousands were raped, and the estimates are around half. So, and that what you're trying to do is to change the composition of the population. Mm-hmm. Another way of committing these mass atrocities is to actually stop them from practicing their culture, whether it's the religious aspects of the culture, or whether it is the rituals, whether it's the food they eat, or whether it is their observances they follow, or the way or the clothes they wear, or the language they speak. And we've had that, for example, in Sri Lanka, where the Sinhala majority eliminated Tamil, the minority language, and said, okay, everyone's got to speak Sinhala now in schools, and Tamil was downgraded or even banned in places, so that in time the hope was that the Tamil population in the north and northeast would kind of just become like the others, in a way, you see. So when you destroy, so today's crimes against humanity are not just physical brutalities. They are eliminating a people's culture, and in many ways they're more subtle, but also far more destructive in a way. I mean, sorry to say, but if someone dies, there are others to replace them usually. Okay, sounds cruel to say that, callous to say that. I don't mean it that way. But the point is, when you destroy a people's way of life, it is completely and totally gone. You see. So that is why you see, for example, in situations now where by kind of disenfranchising people, by stopping their way of life, by changing the culture, other than physically humiliating people, mentally and psychologically humiliating people. And these are all modern, not so modern, they've been there before as well. But effectively, this is what's happening nowadays. So when those acts are taking place in a situation, then I think your threshold is raised. I mean, not threshold. Your analysis is moving towards saying that conflict is bordering on atrocities, and those atrocities may even amount to genocide. Genocide is the precise definition.
Yeah. So another Another question that I had for you is what it comes to personal responsibility and individual responsibility to prevent or stop this kind of atrocities, because I know for a fact, especially in Ethiopia, with what's happening in the Amhara in the Benshangul region towards the ethnically Amhara people, and in other cases as well, it kind of sometimes feels like you're hopeless. There's nothing that you could do. There's nothing that you could do to help. And even like when it comes to the conflict in Tigray and all of that, it's just you can feel that hopelessness, right? So what can individuals do in such cases in order to help, but also to feel like they're contributing to a better outcome?
Okay. Well, I think first point to make, I would say, is generating hopelessness in the target community is very often and very much part of the psychological warfare that's committed. By making your target community feel it's all over, it's all hopeless, nothing can be done, it's finished. Effectively, you are winning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so such feelings have got to be resisted and countered.
Mm-hmm.
They can be resisted and countered by each individual, uh, uh, taking a stance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, uh, what does that mean? I think, firstly, we have to go back a bit, really, and talk about how do we actually inoculate a society against the virus of hatred.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why education is very important, but not uh, not education simply in terms of literacy and learning to read and write and the stuff that everybody does. It's education is about life skills. It's about inculcating values, morals, and in whatever tradition, and whether it's religious or non-religious is not important. What's important is whether or not there is a morality that is underpinning educational efforts of the authorities. And where there are not those efforts or their divisive efforts, then I think it is beholden on community groups and members of society to do that in their homes and in their neighborhoods. So, so the and if that's not already been happening, or that is lost, if you like, or the people who are growing up in a society are growing up with in a miseducated manner, then the mountain to climb is even harder, because not only have you got to re-educate to educate people, but you've got to uneducate people who hold misconceptions and prejudicial ideas around it. And those, by the way, are very, very difficult to dislodge. But coming to the role of the individual, there is no magic answer to this, other than I think for each individual to be their conscience to be provoked and invoked, so that they realize where they stand on this, and that can often, in a divided society, that can often mean taking risks. So, the positive thing in all this is that everywhere you look, there is a lot of opposition. Whether it was the riots in Hong Kong or the riots going on in Myanmar at the moment, or whether people protesting, in America or elsewhere. The fact is that for every person that it holds evil thoughts, there is another one holds good thoughts. So evil doesn't have to predominate. For the good people, then, it's about organizing, it's about having the courage of their convictions, and it's about taking risks. This is why, again, it brings me back to what we were saying earlier on about the lesson of history, where we've known that any advances, even to build peace or construct nations, have had to come through a degree of conflict,
Mm-hmm.
degree of even a degree of violence, of good against
Mm-hmm.
evil. Don't put it in those stark terms. And this is not I'm not an advocate for violence or conflict, but it's just reflecting on what history has taught us. So, in other words, for individuals who wish to stand up and stand against these kinds of things, well, they just have to do the right thing in their own particular lives to start off with. And that starts off with small things like, bullying at schools, or it starts off with being kind to neighbors, or starts off with the small aspects of daily living, and
Mm-hmm.
thereby constructing a culture, whether within their family or within their community, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about organization. So if it was just random good people doing random good things, then
Mm-hmm.
just remain that. And we've just spoken earlier on, I was saying that one of the lessons of history is that all the terribly bad things, crimes against humanity, are committed by organized actors, very often states. So, and the hallmark of that, well, if you study situations like Rwanda, Sudan, Nazi Germany, Cambodia, or even Ethiopia in its paroxysms of violence in the past, you will
Mm-hmm.
see that these are organized things. So therefore, it then comes down to a question of how do good people organize, uh, in a way. And there, people obviously need to use the latest technologies which are now available. Today, it's much easier to do collective good in a way that was not possible in the old days. And it's also much easier to mitigate risks which people took in the old days. It's still risky business trying to stand up to oppression and injustice, you see.
Yeah.
But it's in a sense, people are not. And then, of course, the right leadership needs to come along in that. But be careful. People can't just sit there waiting for good leaders to come. By then, there might not be many good people left if the bad
Mm-hmm.
have their sway. So everyone's got to kind of show their own leadership in this particular area, starting with education, starting with little acts in their own selves and their own neighborhoods, and organizing and using all the tools of management, organization, and social connectivity. And I don't just tweets and Facebook. I mean socialization that to do that, and don't give up. I mean, if you look at the long cycles of history,
Mm-hmm.
uh, things go in cycles, and while bad things can return, and there are many examples of that, generally speaking, the evil phase or the bad phase, its time goes. The only question is how long people have to suffer before the good times or the safer times or better times come again. In some cases, like the Syrian war, the Syrian war, for example, the war in Syria has lasted longer than the Second World War. We've got so used to the war in Syria that we don't even talk about it. It's been going on for so long. It's a kind of backdrop to history that we just now take for granted as part of the planet, the part of world, in a way. So, and that's another important thing to bear in mind as an individual and as a group. Um, you know, don't get immune to the suffering of others. Don't get desensitized. It's one thing about getting desensitized and hurting others, doing bad things to others,
Yeah.
which we discovered is one of the mechanisms for committing crimes against humanity. The reverse is also true. Sometimes when one hears so much and one has got so depressed and demoralized and desensitized to all the suffering of humanity that it's easy to feed into the cycle of hopelessness. Someone, one of the survivors in Sudan once said to me when we were talking about this, and she said that pessimism and cynicism are the refuge of people who have too much, so to speak. In her case, and she was still there, she met her in the Blue Nile, one of the regions of Sudan, and I talk about that. There's video on my website. And she said, for me, I'm going to carry on struggling. So if people like her who have suffered so much haven't given up, then others cannot let them down by giving up. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, wow, that was just, thank you for that. I think the biggest takeaway is to not lose hope, to continue to fight, to continue and to start off little, like you said, right? To start off with yourself, to start off with your immediate contacts, and then organize. And I think one thing that you did say that very stood up to me is like, it's not about if the suffering will go on or it will stop. It's about how long people are going to continue to suffer, and we want to make sure that people are not suffering for that long. And so thank you for that perspective. And I think I guess the last thing I wanted to ask was, especially, like you said, the mass media, and now I guess the social media is being used to say good and to say bad, and somehow we're all stuck in our echo chambers, hearing the same things from our people. So how does, especially if, how does one use those things, right, to advocate for those who are in conflict or suffering because of the violence, but also how does one become aware of what kind of echo chamber that they're in, and to make sure that they're not being fed, they're not being manipulated by these actors that want to commit these atrocities.
Yeah, I mean, as we know from the current debates around COVID, there is a lot of misinformation anyway on the social media, in this case, the coronavirus. And this can actually have a direct bearing on people's lives if you don't get vaccinated, or if you don't believe in taking precautions, or you behave in a rash or irresponsible manner. It costs lives. That is even more so in the cases of conflict, where what you say and how it's received is literally be a matter of life and death. So for the good people, it's on the social media. You would do whatever you do in life. If you see an untruth, counter it repeatedly if necessary, boringly repeatedly if necessary. Not because your counter tweet is going to necessarily change the narrative, but unless the narrative is challenged, it will be will be recorded by history. So contest it, counter it, and that's what you can do. And on the other side also, you can, I think, be well informed before you trust anyone's information. Educate yourself, check it, rely on reliable sources, as well as to try and be a disseminator of truth yourself, and then disseminator of balance, rather than feed the fire with your own opinions. I mean, opinion is good, and if one stands for justice and countering injustice, obviously that's an opinion, but it's at least based on a value system where you think something is unfair. So, in the overall order of things, we're in this dichotomy. On the one hand, it's much better to have your fights on Twitter than to take up a gun and shoot, right? On the other, and then on the converse side, we do know that there are those gullible people out there who progress from their Twitter fights through physical violence as well. And so and we know that the power of the word, that
Mhm.
the word is mightier than the sword, as the expression goes. So what one says on the media, or one listens to, or how interprets it or rebroadcasts it, is
Mhm.
always extremely important. But again, it's the same principle: stand
Mhm.
up, counter, and be a propagator of good things rather than bad.
Yeah. And I think what came back to my mind is earlier you said that when people are trying to manipulate, like especially the people who have like other interests, whether it be political power, resources, whatever interest that they have in order to commit these atrocities, the first thing that they do is feed the fear, make you fear for your survival, make you angry, and just feed into that bad energy. So I think like it's one thing, like you said, we have to watch what we are consuming, and if all people are just continuously feeding us fear and fear and fear, we have to, like, we have to be cognizant of that fact, because like you said, it's the weapon of those who want to wield the power. um, but one last thing I wanted to ask you was the history. As we've mentioned before, Ethiopia has a very intricate and very long history. So there's parts of our history, obviously, that are, that are very traumatic to people, and people have suffered through it, and all over the country. So how does one understand that history, but not get, but not use it to fuel other atrocities, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ethiopia kind of puzzles me, and at the same time, depresses me. But I remain optimistic. I
Mhm.
mean, we are told that the Ethiopian civilization is a very ancient one. It goes back God knows how many millennia, and there's a huge history, big history about it. And at the same time, it's one of the most recurrent nightmares of the African continent.
Mhm.
I think the way I would approach this would, it would be to say to my Ethiopian friends that they need to, one, understand their history, uh,
Mhm.
direction, rather than read one side history.
Mhm.
Secondly, they have to accept that history. Now, if you look at modern Germany, the reason I think, even though Germans are as prone as any other society to hatred of others, but what the post Nazi administrations of Germany have done is that they have ensured that every German is aware of
Mhm.
Nazi history, so that
Mhm.
nobody can say, "I didn't know that our people have done these bad things." So it's very, very important that Ethiopians of all shades and groups, and north and south, and whichever group they belong to or languages they ascribe to, they
Mhm.
have a fundamental grounding in everyone's history from
Mhm.
all perspectives. It's only when you honestly do that can there be the understanding necessary and the insight gained that is
Mhm.
going to be necessary to find a way forward. If you only read the history and newspapers that tell you what your side is saying, and not what the other side is saying, then we're going to carry on. The Ethiopians are going to carry on feeding the same old few, and
Mhm.
and and hurting the same old wounds, if you like, pouring oil on the same
Mhm.
fire, if you like, if you like. Now, visiting the history, revisiting it from all angles, is not something that is done in an instant. And
Mhm.
people have to debate this. There are arguments and so on. So I think Ethiopia has a generational challenge to it. Okay, so I am not optimistic that somehow tomorrow the problems of Ethiopia are going to be resolved by either some new constitutional change or
Mhm.
some new governance arrangement, or some new rules and regulations. Though all those might be necessary, and democracy is very important, and and creating a democracy where everyone feels equal rather than one side dominate and the other side is important part of the governance project of Ethiopia. But it's easier said than done in a democracy. This is a generational battle. I would think it's at least another 20 years work. It's generations like you, maybe not even you, maybe your children that are going to actually have to turn the corner. But probably, and you're a young person, much younger than me, hopefully in your lifetime you will see at least a degree of stability. But I think even in your generation, you will be constantly vulnerable for at least the next 2 decades that of the resurgence of conflict. Again, this is what history tells us. So nothing has happened in history that has not happened before.
Yes.
Right? And ask yourself the question, if it has happened in history for past decades or centuries, what is the likelihood that it will happen again in the next decades? Yeah. So once one is realistic like that, then the job of trying to correct so that we get off that particular hamster's wheel of cycle will at least, it will not be easier, but at least it will be done in a self-conscious manner. At least it will be done in perception that we're not going to see peace in my lifetime. Certainly, probably not in my lifetime. But I hope it will be stable in your lifetime, and definitely I hope that your children will say, "Okay, oh, we'll study about it in textbooks. Oh yeah, this is how things were all those years ago. How terrible! How could our parents behave in this idiotic manner?"
Yes. And
is what I'm saying. A long, patient people.
I think that's a very sombering view to see, and
Sobering, but I don't want you to be pessimistic.
no, not to be pessimistic, but I think like it's a sobering view in a way that it makes you really understand the amount of work that needs to be done, the amount of what needs to be done in order for us to have our children look at it from a historical perspective instead of their reality being that. So although like yes, it might take long, but it's also good to know there's a lot of work, and I'm really hoping that that will be the case, and I will try my best, and I'll try to make sure that those around me will try their best in order to give that to the next generation, if not ours. Well, thank you so much. This has been a very good conversation, and I've gotten a lot from it, and I'm hoping that those who are viewing it will also be able to get a lot of information from it. Like I mentioned, Dr. Kapila has 2 books out, Against a Tide of Evil and No Stranger to Kindness. Please make sure to go to his website to read more about his work, his amazing work, and his books, and to learn more about his organization. Thank you so much. And then for those who are watching, please look down below in the description. We'll be including resources to help those who are impacted by the recent ethnic conflict, as well as those who are affected by the conflict in Tigray. Please make sure to go and support those organizations that are helping everyday Ethiopians. Thank you so much, Doctor, and thank you for your time, and you have a good day.
Thank you, Manan, and I hope your collaborators and colleagues, you made them think, and keep on thinking. And tell them to ask this one question: do you want to live past history, or do you want to make new history? Look forward. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.